The fog clung to the hollows like a shroud, wrapping the twisted branches of ancient oaks in a perpetual twilight. In the forgotten corner of West Virginia where the mountains swallowed secrets whole, the town of Odd Hollow squatted under a sky that never quite cleared. Elijah Kane pulled his battered sedan off the cracked asphalt of Route 19, the engine coughing as if reluctant to venture deeper. He'd come chasing whispers, online forums buzzing with tales of families so entwined in their own blood that the outside world had become a myth. The Whitakers, they called one clan, a name that evoked images of hollow-eyed figures huddled in ramshackle homes, their speech a garbled echo of isolation. And then there were the Fugates, ghosts from Kentucky's shadowed past, their skin tinged with an unnatural blue that spoke of unions too close, veins carrying a curse from the hills. Elijah stepped out, the chill air biting through his coat, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. The woods loomed just beyond the roadside diner, their depths impenetrable even in midday. He'd heard the stories, voices murmuring in the dark, calling names that hadn't been spoken in generations. Locals avoided the trails after dusk, claiming the trees themselves whispered warnings. As he pushed open the diner's door, the bell jingling like a distant scream, eyes turned toward him, suspicious, sunken gazes from faces etched with the wear of hard lives. The waitress, her skin pale as moonlit fog, poured coffee without a word, her fingers trembling slightly. That night, in a motel room that smelled of mildew and regret, Elijah lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, something else stirred, a low murmur, indistinct at first, like conversations muffled by walls. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Words formed in the darkness. Stay away, blood calls blood. He shook it off, blaming exhaustion, but as sleep finally claimed him, dreams invaded of blue figures wandering misty forests, their eyes pleading, and a family gathered in a circle, their features melting into one another, indistinguishable in the gloom. Little did he know, the voices were just beginning to speak his name. The mountains of southern West Virginia rose like ancient guardians, their ridges cloaked in dense forest that seemed to press in on the narrow winding roads, isolating pockets of humanity from the rest of the world. In one such forgotten hollow lay the unincorporated community of Odd, a place whose very name evoked curiosity and unease among those few outsiders who ever stumbled upon it. Scattered homes dotted the landscape along Tommy Creek, weathered structures sagging under the weight of time and hardship, surrounded by hills that swallowed sound and light alike. It was here, in this remote corner of Raleigh County, that rumors had persisted for years, whispers carried on the wind about families buried deep in the woods, clans so withdrawn that they had turned inward, generation after generation, binding themselves in ways that defied the natural order. Elijah Kane, a journalist hardened by years chasing stories in urban shadows, had first encountered these tales online, buried in obscure forums and grainy videos that hinted at something profoundly unsettling. Skeptical by nature, he dismissed much of it as exaggeration, the kind of folklore that thrived in impoverished rural areas long stereotyped by the outside world. Yet something about the fragmented accounts gnawed at him, mentions of a family called the Whitakers, living in squalor on a dirt road off the beaten path, their communication reduced to grunts and barks, their features marked by the unmistakable signs of genetic isolation. Parallel threads spoke of older legends from nearby Kentucky, the Fugates of Troublesome Creek, whose skin carried a bluish tint from a rare blood condition amplified by centuries of intermarriage in secluded hollows. These were not mere ghost stories, they were echoes of real people, hidden away in Appalachia's unforgiving terrain, where poverty, limited access to the outside, and a fierce protectiveness had allowed dark secrets to fester. Driven by a mix of professional curiosity and a vague sense of moral compulsion, Elijah decided to investigate firsthand. He packed his recorder, camera, and a notebook into his old sedan, leaving behind the bustle of Charleston for the long drive south. As he turned off the interstate onto increasingly narrow backroads, the world outside his windows grew quieter, the cell signal fading like a distant memory. The air thickened with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in fractured beams, casting long shadows that danced across the asphalt. He told himself this was just another assignment, a dive into human eccentricity, but a quiet doubt lingered. Why did locals in nearby towns avert their eyes when the subject arose, warning strangers to stay clear of certain hollows after dark? Pulling into Odd as dusk began to settle, Elijah felt the weight of unseen gazes from porches and windows. The community was small, unassuming, with no real center, just a scattering of homes, a post office, and trails leading into impenetrable woods. Parked outside a rundown diner, he stepped out into the cooling air, the gravel crunching under his boots like brittle bones. He had come skeptical, armed with rationality, but the oppressive silence of the surrounding hills already whispered that some truths were better left buried. The rumors had drawn him here, promising revelation, yet as the fog rolled in from the creek, thickening around the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountains themselves were wary of what he sought. The motel room on the edge of Odd was a relic from another era, its peeling wallpaper the color of nicotine stains and its single window overlooking a gravel lot where semis idled through the night. Elijah had chosen it because it was the only place within 20 miles that still took cash and asked no questions. After a restless day spent knocking on doors that remained firmly shut and nursing lukewarm coffee in the diner while locals pretended he didn't exist, he returned as the last light bled from the sky. The mountains seemed to close in tighter after dark, their silhouettes blotting out the stars until only a thin strip of indigo remained overhead. He showered quickly, the water sputtering brown before clearing, and changed into an old t-shirt and sweatpants. The room smelled of mildew and stale cigarette smoke that no amount of bleach could erase. He set his recorder and notebook on the scarred nightstand, reviewed a few scribbled notes under the weak glow of a bedside lamp, then killed the light. The bed creaked as he lay back, the mattress sagging in the middle like it had surrendered years ago. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose pane in its frame and sending drafts across the floorboards. At first, the sounds were ordinary branches scraping against the motel's tin roof, the distant rumble of a coal truck grinding gears on the highway. Elijah's eyes adjusted to the darkness, tracing the faint outlines of water stains on the ceiling that resembled twisted faces. Sleep tugged at him, heavy from the long drive and the day's quiet rejections. Just as he drifted toward the edge of unconsciousness, something shifted in the rhythm of the night. The wind continued its low moan, but beneath it threaded another layer, a softer cadence, almost conversational, rising and falling like voices carried from far away. He told himself it was imagination, the mind's trick of filling silence with pattern. Yet the murmurs persisted, faint enough that he couldn't make out words, only the suggestion of them. They seemed to come from the woods behind the motel, where the tree line pressed close to the back fence. Elijah sat up slowly, heart quickening, and leaned toward the window. The glass was cool against his forehead as he peered out. Nothing moved in the lot except the slow sway of a rusted swing set left over from some long-gone family era. The whispers grew marginally clearer, or perhaps his ears attuned to them, fragments that dissolved the moment he tried to focus. He rubbed his eyes, blaming fatigue, the altitude, the strange weight of isolation that settled over these hollows. Lying back down, he pulled the thin blanket to his chin and forced his breathing to slow. The wind howled again, masking the sounds, and for a while he believed they were gone. But as the room grew colder and the night deepened, the murmurs returned, patient and persistent, threading through the darkness like smoke seeking cracks. They were not loud enough to record, not distinct enough to prove, yet they lingered at the threshold of hearing, brushing against his awareness with an intimacy that made the hairs on his arms rise. In that suspended hour before true sleep, Elijah lay listening to the voices in the dark, dismissing them even as some quieter part of him began to wonder what, exactly, they were trying to say. The next morning broke grey and drizzling, the kind of rain that seeped into everything without ever truly pouring. Elijah nursed a styrofoam cup of bitter coffee at the diner's counter, the only customer apart from an old man in overalls who stared into his eggs as though they held the answers to questions no one dared ask. The waitress from the night before, her name tag read Betty, moved with the same quiet efficiency, refilling his cup without meeting his eyes. He had tried casual conversation the day before and gotten nothing but monosyllables, so this time he simply watched the room, noting how conversations hushed when he shifted on the cracked vinyl stool. It was Betty who finally broke the silence, wiping the counter in slow circles long after it was clean. Her voice was low, almost lost beneath the hiss of the grill. "You the one asking around about the folks up in the hollows?" Elijah nodded, keeping his expression neutral. She glanced toward the rain-streaked window, where the mountains loomed like silent sentinels. "Ain't my place to say much, But there's blood up there that don't mix with the rest of the world no more. Been that way since my granny's time. He leaned in slightly, careful not to crowd her. The Whitakers. She flinched at the name, as if it carried weight enough to bruise them and others before. Way back, over in Kentucky, there were the blue ones, the Fugates. Skin like dusk, veins showing through like river maps. Folks said it started with one man, an orphan from away, married too close to his own kin to keep the land in the family. Kept marrying cousins, brothers to sisters, till the blood turned strange. Doctors came later, called it something scientific, but the old ones knew it for a curse. Betty's cloth stilled. Outside, thunder rumbled low in the hills. Here it's different. No blue skin, just, eyes too close, words that don't come right. They say the Whitakers started pulling away after the mines closed, when money dried up and roads washed out. Easier to stay among themselves than face the world judging. Generation after generation, same houses, same names on the mailboxes till there ain't but a handful left. Folks call 'em cursed bloodlines, say the mountains keep 'em 'cause the mountains don't judge. The old man at the end of the counter cleared his throat, a warning rasp. Betty straightened, resuming her wiping as though she'd never spoken. But her words lingered in the air like the damp outside, heavy with the scent of wet leaves and secrets. Elijah felt the chill deepen, not from the rain but from the way she'd said cursed bloodlines, the phrase carrying centuries of whispered caution. Other patrons avoided his gaze, focusing on their plates or the scarred formica, as if acknowledging him might invite the same isolation that clung to those hidden families. He paid his bill in silence, stepping back into the drizzle that blurred the edges of the parking lot. The woods across the road seemed darker now, the trees leaning inward as though listening. Betty's warning echoed with every footstep on the wet gravel, a quiet admonition from a town that had learned long ago to look away from certain hollows where the blood had turned inward, coiling tighter with each passing year, binding families to shadows the rest of the world preferred to forget. That afternoon the rain eased into a fine mist, turning the dirt roads into slick red clay that sucked at Elijah's boots as he followed a faint trail branching off from the main hollow. He had left the diner with Betty's words still ringing, cursed bloodlines, and a crumpled hand-drawn map from a reluctant gas station attendant who had muttered something about old Whitaker land before clamming up. The path wound upward through stands of rhododendron so thick the daylight dimmed to perpetual dusk, the air heavy with the smell of wet bark and decaying leaves. Elijah's plan had been simple. Scout the perimeter, look for signs of habitation, maybe catch a glimpse of the family that everyone spoke of in lowered voices. He wasn't here to intrude, he told himself, only to understand. Yet the deeper he walked, the more the forest seemed to resist, branches snagging at his jacket, roots rising like deliberate traps. After nearly an hour the trail opened into a small clearing dominated by the remnants of an ancient chestnut tree, its massive trunk long hollowed by rot yet still standing, a skeletal giant against the grey sky. Tucked beneath its gnarled roots, half buried in moss and leaf litter, lay a weathered leather satchel. Elijah crouched, brushing away decades of debris, and carefully lifted it. The leather was cracked and darkened by moisture, the brass clasp rusted but intact. Inside he found a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, a diary, its pages warped but legible, bound in faded maroon cloth. The handwriting was spidery, the ink browned with age, and the first entry was dated 1897. As he sat on a fallen log and began to read by the weak light filtering through the canopy, the words pulled him into another century. The writer, an ancestor named Elias Whitaker, spoke of arriving in these hills after the Civil War with little more than a land grant and a fierce determination to keep the family holdings intact. Outsiders were scarce, roads non-existent, and the mines had yet to carve their scars across the mountains. Elias wrote of marrying his first cousin to prevent the parcel from being divided, of encouraging the same among his children to preserve what is ours, pure and untainted by foreign blood. Each generation, he noted with pride, stayed closer, the marriages tighter, the children fewer but truer to the line. Later entries grew darker. Births marked by deformities, minds that wandered, tempers that flared without cause. Elias justified it all as the price of purity, claiming the land itself demanded the sacrifice, that the hollows whispered approval when the blood remained undiluted. The final pages were frantic, describing dreams of voices in the trees urging the family deeper into isolation, promising protection in exchange for obedience. The last line, scrawled in a trembling hand, read, "We are bound now, not just to each other, but to this place. The blood remembers." Elijah closed the diary slowly, the mist beading on his skin like cold sweat. The clearing felt smaller, the chestnut tree looming closer, its hollow trunk gaping like an open mouth. Somewhere in the distance a branch cracked, sharp as a warning. He slipped the diary into his backpack, the weight of it heavier than leather and paper should allow, and stood. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, no bird calls, no rustle of small creatures, only the soft patter of mist on leaves. He turned back toward the trail, the path suddenly less clear than before, and as he walked he couldn't shake the sense that the words he had just read were not merely history, but a deliberate message left for someone like him, someone who had come looking. The mountains kept their secrets well, but every secret, Elijah realized, began with an invitation. The following day Elijah rose before dawn, the diary's words etched into his thoughts like acid on metal. He drove deeper into the hollows along a rutted track barely wide enough for his sedan, the tires spinning in mud before catching on gravel. The map from the gas station attendant ended at a washed-out bridge, forcing him to continue on foot. Mist hung low between the trees, turning every trunk into a blurred column, and the only sound was his own breathing and the occasional drip of water from overhanging leaves. He followed an overgrown logging road that climbed gradually, the underbrush so dense it brushed against his legs like insistent fingers. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, time felt elastic in the grey light, until the trail dipped into a narrow ravine where the air grew colder and the scent of wood smoke appeared, faint but unmistakable. Elijah slowed, moving from tree to tree, until he spotted it, a small cabin half swallowed by the hillside, its roof sagging under moss and years of neglect. Chimney smoke curled lazily into the mist, and the single window was dark, reflecting nothing. He was debating whether to approach when a figure emerged from the tree line opposite him, pale, almost translucent in the dimness, with wide, unblinking eyes that caught what little light remained. The stranger wore patched overalls and a threadbare flannel shirt, his posture slightly hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. He froze when he saw Elijah, head tilting in an oddly bird-like motion, then raised one thin hand in a gesture that might have been warning or greeting. Elijah took a cautious step forward, palms open. The man did not flee. Instead, he turned and shuffled toward the cabin, glancing back once as if inviting pursuit. Curiosity overrode caution. Elijah followed at a distance, boots silent on the damp needles. The stranger pushed open the warped door without knocking and disappeared inside. Elijah hesitated on the threshold, the interior a cavern of shadows broken only by the orange flicker of a hearth. Stepping in, he found a single room cluttered with the debris of decades, rusted tools, yellowed newspapers, jars of unidentifiable preserves lining crooked shelves. The stranger stood near the fireplace, staring at him with those unnerving wide eyes, skin so pale the blue veins beneath seemed to pulse. No one else appeared to be present, yet the moment Elijah crossed the doorway a sound rose, low, overlapping murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Voices echoed softly off the rough-hewn walls, words indistinguishable but carrying the cadence of conversation, argument, lament. The pale man tilted his head again, listening as though the voices spoke directly to him. Elijah's pulse hammered in his ears, the murmurs grew fractionally louder, threading through the crackle of the fire, brushing against his skin like cold breath. They rose and fell in waves, sometimes overlapping, sometimes falling into sudden silence that felt heavier than sound. The stranger watched him, expression unreadable, while the unseen chorus continued its patient discourse in the dimness of the cabin, as though the walls themselves had learned to speak in tongues long forgotten by the outside world. That night Elijah returned to the motel with the pale stranger's silence echoing in his mind, the cabin's inexplicable voices still brushing against his thoughts like cobwebs. He spread the diary on the small table beneath the lamp and turned to a section he had skimmed earlier, yellowed pages marked with crude sketches of family trees, branches looping back upon themselves in tightening spirals. As rain began to drum against the roof, the entries pulled him backward through time, the ink fading but the story sharpening into focus. It began in the early 1800s along the winding course of Troublesome Creek in eastern Kentucky, where a French orphan named Martin Fugate settled with a pale red-haired woman named Elizabeth Smith. They carved a homestead from the dense wilderness, far from any road or neighbor, and raised 7 children in near-total isolation. 4 of those children, the diary noted with clinical detachment, were born with skin the color of twilight, deep blue lips, fingernails like indigo, cheeks stained as though bruised from within. Doctors would later name it methemoglobinemia, a rare enzyme deficiency that starved the blood of oxygen, but to the hollow folk it was simply the mark of blood turned too far inward. The Fugates married within the narrow circle of nearby clans, Hensons, Combses, Smiths, all drawn from the same sparse pool of settlers who had ventured into the steep, unforgiving hills. Land was scarce, travel treacherous, and the outside world offered little temptation when survival demanded every hand stay close. Cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces when widows needed protection, and the blue tint deepened with each generation, passed like an heirloom through recessive genes that thrived in the absence of fresh blood. By the 1890s, entire branches of the family carried the trait, their skin shifting from slate to violet under strain or cold, eyes dark against the unnatural pallor. The diary's anonymous compiler, perhaps a Whitaker cousin by marriage who had migrated westward, recorded visits to Troublesome Creek with a mix of fascination and dread. He described gatherings where blue-skinned children played silently in the yard, their laughter muted, as though the color itself absorbed sound. Elders spoke of the first union between Martin and Elizabeth as forbidden, not by law but by something older, an unspoken pact with the land that demanded payment for its isolation. Some claimed the hue was punishment, others a sign of distinction, proof that the family had become something apart from common humanity. Births grew harder, infants sometimes stillborn with lips already purpled, survivors often frail yet stubbornly enduring. The Fugates retreated deeper into the folds of the mountains, avoiding photographs, shunning the rare traveling preacher who warned of divine retribution. By the time the railroad pushed tentative fingers into the region, the Blue people had become legend, glimpsed only in shadow or spoken of in whispers that carried across state lines into West Virginia's own secluded hollows. The diary's writer closed the section with a single chilling observation, that the color was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper binding, one that did not fade with distance or time, but waited patiently in the veins for the blood to circle back upon itself once more. Rain lashed the motel window harder now, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray, and Elijah felt the weight of centuries pressing down through the pages, the forbidden union of long ago still echoing in the isolated clans that had inherited its silence. Back at the motel, Elijah spread his laptop and notes across the bed, the screen's glow the only light in the room as night pressed against the windows. The pale stranger's wide-eyed stare lingered in his memory, those veins too visible beneath translucent skin, the cabin's voices still echoing faintly in his ears. He had snapped discreet photographs before leaving, grainy shots of the cluttered interior, the hearth's dying embers, the man's hunched silhouette against the wall. Now, uploading them to his encrypted drive, he began cross-referencing with the diary's cryptic references and the scattered online fragments he had collected before cell service vanished entirely. What emerged chilled him more than the mountain air seeping through the cracks. Hidden forums and archived documentaries spoke of living remnants, families tucked into the deepest hollows where roads turned to mud and outsiders rarely ventured. In West Virginia's Raleigh County, not far from where he sat, the Whitakers clung to existence in a cluster of decaying shacks along a forgotten dirt track in Odd. Generations had folded inward after the mines closed, poverty and isolation weaving tighter bonds than any outsider could understand. Children born with eyes set too close, limbs malformed, speech reduced to guttural sounds and protective barks, traits amplified by blood that circled back upon itself, brother to sister, cousin to cousin, the family tree twisting into knots. Recent accounts painted a grim present, homes ravaged by fire, living conditions so dire that state services had intervened quietly, removing the most vulnerable elderly siblings and their offspring to unknown care facilities, leaving the remaining few in echoing silence amid watchful dogs and sagging porches. Deformities ran deep, not just physical but etched into daily life, communication fractured, minds shadowed by the weight of inherited fragility. Elijah zoomed in on blurred images from viral videos, faces marked by the unmistakable signs of recessive genes unleashed in a closed loop, skin pale and drawn, expressions vacant yet fiercely guarded. Further searches pulled him back to Kentucky's Troublesome Creek, where the Fugates' legacy had faded but not vanished entirely. The blue tint, once vivid as dusk on lips and nails, had diluted with time and outward migration, treatable now with simple dye tablets that restored oxygen to the blood. Yet descendants carried echoes, fleeting hues under stress or cold, a reminder that the isolation of old hollows had once painted entire branches of a family in unnatural shades. Elijah leaned back, the laptop fan humming like distant whispers. These were not ancient tales confined to yellowed pages, they persisted in the modern day, hidden in plain sight among the ridges, where poverty locked doors tighter than any curse. Evidence piled up in photographs and reports, misshapen features, limited words, lives bound to crumbling properties far from medical reach or societal judgment. The diary's pride in pure lines now read as tragedy, a deliberate turning inward that birthed suffering across decades. As thunder rumbled over the hills, Elijah realized the voices he had heard were not spectral but human, fragmented cries from bloodlines still coiling in the dark, descendants living in secrecy, their deformities a living testament to choices made long ago in the name of preservation. The mountains held them close, concealing the full extent of what closeness had wrought. Each night after returning from the trails, Elijah found sleep elusive, the motel room's thin walls doing little to muffle the wind's relentless push through the cracks. The whispers he had first dismissed as imagination now returned with insistence, no longer confined to the woods but seeping into his waking hours. They began subtly during his drives along the winding backroads, faint overlays beneath the engine's hum, like distant radio static resolving into syllables. At first fragmented, mere breaths of sound, they sharpened as the days wore on, carrying tones of urgency, regret, even accusation. By the fourth night, lying rigid under the threadbare quilt, Elijah heard them clearly enough to distinguish patterns. The voices layered over one another, some hoarse and gravelly, others high and wavering, as though spoken through constricted throats. They spoke in broken phrases, repetitions worn smooth by endless retelling. Keep it close, don't let it out, blood stays here. Interspersed were sharper bursts, snarls that dissolved into guttural noises, not quite words but raw expressions of frustration or pain. He recognized echoes of the sounds captured in those viral videos, the grunts and barks attributed to communication barriers born of isolation, now amplified into something more invasive. The whispers intensified after midnight, swelling until the room felt crowded with unseen presences. They recounted fragments of lives confined to crumbling porches and shadowed hollows, confessions of tempers that erupted without warning, of minds fractured by inherited shadows, of acts committed in the heat of madness that the bloodline could neither escape nor fully comprehend. One voice, deeper than the rest, repeated tales of violence handed down like heirlooms, hands raised in anger over scarce resources, isolation breeding paranoia until neighbor became threat, family turning inward with claws bared. Another wove in laments of frailty, bodies betraying their owners with seizures or sudden rages, minds slipping into realms where reality blurred. Elijah pressed palms to his ears, but the sounds burrowed deeper, psychological echoes of genetic burdens documented in studies. He had skimmed recessive traits unleashing not just physical deformities but cognitive fractures, heightened risks of retardation, instability that manifested in outbursts or withdrawal. The voices seemed to draw from those very consequences, fragmented admissions of lives warped by choices made generations ago to preserve land and lineage at any cost. Madness, they implied, was not a sudden visitor but a slow accumulation, passed through veins like the blue tint of old Kentucky kin or the silenced speech of modern descendants. As dawn crept grey through the curtains, the murmurs subsided into sighs, leaving Elijah drenched in sweat, questioning his own sanity. The mountains outside stood silent, complicit guardians of these nocturnal revelations, and he wondered if the whispers were external at all or merely the mind's way of voicing truths too disturbing to face in daylight. They grew louder with each passing night, more insistent in their fragmented confessions, pulling him toward an understanding that violence and madness were not aberrations but inevitable threads woven into bloodlines coiled too tightly upon themselves. The darkness held them patiently, amplifying echoes that refused to fade. On the fifth evening, with the whispers clinging to him like damp fog, Elijah ventured back along the overgrown trail to the ravine cabin, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The pale stranger was there again, silhouetted against the hearth's low glow, rocking slowly in a chair carved from rough pine. This time, he did not flee. Instead, as Elijah approached the open doorway, the man raised his head, those wide eyes fixing on him with a recognition that sent ice through his veins. No words passed at first, only the familiar rise of murmurs from the walls, softer now, almost conversational. Elijah stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The stranger, Elijah had come to think of him as Harlan, from a faded name scratched on a shelf, gestured to a crate opposite the fire. Elijah sat, the heat barely cutting the chill. Harlan reached under his chair and pulled out a rusted biscuit tin, its lid dented and scarred. With trembling hands, he opened it, revealing a stack of photographs, edges curled and yellowed, some in cracked frames, others loose like fallen leaves. The first image Harlan laid on the crate showed a group from another era, men and women posed stiffly on a porch much like the Whitakers' scattered homes, faces marked by the same close-set eyes and pale skin. Harlan's finger traced one figure, a woman with lips tinged unnaturally dark, a Fugate descendant perhaps, migrated westward. Next came grainy snapshots of children with bluish hues around their mouths, gathered on troublesome creek's banks, their stares direct and unblinking into the camera. Harlan lingered on these, his breath hitching as the voices in the room swelled in response, weaving tales of isolation that needed no translation. Deeper in the tin lay more recent horrors, Polaroids of deformed infants cradled in shadowed rooms, adults with limbs twisted or features asymmetrical, expressions vacant yet watchful. Some captured the Whitakers themselves, huddled on sagging porches amid barking dogs, communicating in grunts and gestures, their home a patchwork of decay. Harlan spread them carefully, as if handling relics, pointing to individuals with a sorrow that transcended words. He shared tales through halting signs and guttural sounds, miming rituals of seclusion, families gathering at dusk to reinforce bonds too tight, warding off outsiders who brought judgment or change. The voices amplified Harlan's silent narrative, layering confessions of stay close and blood knows blood, commands to remain hidden in the hollows where the mountains offered protection. Harlan's eyes pleaded as he pushed the photos toward Elijah, a desperate offering from one cast out for questioning the old ways. In those images lay proof of generations coiled inward, deformities and silences passed like inheritance, the blue tint faded but its legacy enduring in fractured minds and bodies. The fire popped, casting flickering shadows that danced across the faces in the photographs, making them seem alive, watching. Harlan clutched Elijah's sleeve then, a fragile alliance forged. The reliance with Harlan deepened over subsequent visits, the cabin becoming a reluctant sanctuary amid the thickening fog of whispers that now followed Elijah even into town. Harlan, cast aside years earlier for his refusal to fully embrace the clan's rigid customs, moved with a wary grace, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and a burning need to unmask what he called the old binding. He spoke little, his voice a rasping whisper damaged by disuse, but his gestures painted vivid horrors as he delved further into the biscuit tin's contents. One twilight evening, as the fire cast elongated shadows across the walls where the voices hummed in approval, Harlan produced a bundle of brittle newspaper clippings and handwritten notes, yellowed testimonies from those who had glimpsed the clan's hidden rites. They described gatherings deep in unmarked clearings, circles formed under moonless skies where family members, features blurred by generations of closeness, chanted in guttural unison, invoking the mountain's protection. The rituals reinforced isolation, vows renewed to keep blood pure, outsiders repelled as threats to the fragile equilibrium. Harlan mimed the scenes with trembling hands, elders tracing symbols on bark, younger ones swaying in trance-like states, the air thick with incense from native herbs that induced visions of spectral guardians. The voices in the cabin responded vividly during these revelations, rising in layered choruses that seemed to emanate from the very log's ancient commands echoing stay within, guard the line, promises of strength in exchange for unwavering obedience. Harlan pointed to faded photographs of these ceremonies, blurred figures in homemade robes, faces obscured yet unmistakably marked by the clan's traits, eyes too near, expressions vacant in devotion. He shared tales of spectral guides through signs and dreams, ethereal forms appearing at forest edges, urging strays back to the fold, punishing doubt with illness or madness. Those who questioned, like Harlan himself, were exiled to the periphery, tolerated only if silent, their warnings ignored as betrayal. Elijah recorded what he could, the murmurs growing possessive, weaving around Harlan's halting explanations like threads tightening a noose. The rituals, Harlan conveyed, were not mere superstition but survival mechanisms, born from the diary's pride in purity and amplified by poverty's grip. Land too poor for division, roads too treacherous for escape, blood the only reliable bond in a world that offered none. Yet the cost manifested in the photos: children born frail, minds adrift, bodies twisted, all offered as proof of the guide's favor. Harlan's eyes filled with unshed tears as he clutched a final image, a group portrait where translucent figures seemed to hover at the edges, watchers from beyond ensuring the circle remained unbroken. The betrayal came swiftly after that session, as Elijah stepped outside for air and spotted distant flashlight beams cutting through the trees, figures approaching the ravine with purposeful quiet. Harlan's face drained of what little color it held, realizing his sharing had drawn the clan's attention, the voices shifting from guidance to accusation in the thickening dark. The spectral guides, it seemed, demanded loyalty above all, and in exposing their rituals, Harlan had invited retribution upon them both. The mountains closed in, the whispers turning hostile, as footsteps crunched closer through the underbrush. As the flashlight beams sliced through the ravine and the crunch of footsteps grew louder, Harlan shoved Elijah toward a narrow back exit hidden behind a tattered quilt hanging on the wall. They stumbled into the night, the cold air sharp with pine and impending rain, the voices in the cabin erupting into a cacophony of rage and betrayal that seemed to pursue them through the trees. Branches whipped at their faces as they ran blindly uphill, Harlan's laborde breathing a guide in the darkness, the clan's shouts echoing behind like hounds on a scent. They burst into a moonlit clearing ringed by ancient oaks, the ground carpeted in centuries of fallen leaves that muffled their steps. Harlan collapsed against a trunk, clutching his side, eyes wide with terror as the pursuer's lights flickered closer. Elijah spun, searching for escape, when the whispers shifted, no longer fragmented confessions but a unified chorus rising from the earth itself, from the roots twisting beneath their feet, from the hollows of the trees. The voices coalesced into clarity for the first time, speaking not in broken phrases but in layered harmony, ancient and sorrowful. They were the trapped souls of the bloodlines, generations who had paid the price for the binding, infants lost to frailty, minds shattered by madness, bodies deformed and discarded in unmarked graves scattered through these hills. The spectral guides the clan revered were not protectors but prisoners, echoes of the dead cursed to enforce the isolation that had doomed them. Each intermarriage had tightened the chain, each vow to keep the blood pure adding another link, trapping spirits in eternal vigil over descendants who repeated the same fatal choices. The blue tint of the Fugates, the silenced speech of the Whitakers, the violence and retreat, all manifestations of a curse self-inflicted yet inescapable, the mountains complicit wardens holding the souls as collateral. The voices swelled, addressing Elijah directly now, his name woven into their lament like a thread pulled loose. Harlan stared at him in dawning horror, realizing the journalist's arrival had been no accident. The diary left beneath the chestnut tree, the whispers drawing him deeper, the chance encounters all orchestrated by the trapped chorus seeking release through fresh blood that carried their own forgotten markers. Elijah felt it then, a cold recognition uncoiling in his veins, features in old family photos he had always dismissed as coincidence, a pallor that deepened in winter, dreams of hollows he had never visited. The clan emerged at the clearing's edge, silhouettes halting as the voices turned thunderous, revealing the eternal curse in full, souls bound to enforce the isolation until the line finally broke or consumed itself entirely. Harlan reached for Elijah in desperate apology, but the chorus rose higher, demanding reckoning, as the mountains themselves seemed to lean inward, holding the revelation close. Elijah understood at last that he was not merely witness but inheritor, his hidden heritage the final key the trapped souls had waited generations to turn. The lights closed in, the voices cresting in a wail that shook the leaves from the trees, cursing the bloodline with the only truth it had ever known, entrapment forever in the dark woods where no outsider truly left unchanged.